Hey y'all, thanks for joining us for another edition of the Rose Chat podcast. On this episode, you'll hear from Jason Powell from Petals From The Past in Jemison, Alabama, and he shares a presentation with the Birmingham Rose Society about how you can integrate old garden variety roses into a modern landscape. It's a presentation you don't want to miss. Stay with us. The Rose Chat podcast starts now.
It's time for the Rose Chat podcast, a podcast dedicated to celebrating the world's most beloved flower, the rose. Join award-winning gardeners Chris Van Cleef and Teresa Byington as they chat with rose lovers and experts from around the globe. With each episode, you'll gain valuable knowledge and insights to achieve the rose garden you've always dreamed of. Listen now as we explore the world of roses.
Try Haven brand soil conditioners, providing generations of gardeners with a truly all-natural alternative to chemical fertilizers with their line of composted manure and alfalfa teas. Easy to brew and use on all indoor and outdoor plants. Find them online at manuretea.com.
Thank you so much for the welcome and for the invitation to come and talk with you today. It's always a little intimidating when you're talking to a Rose Society about roses, particularly as knowledgeable Rose Society as you guys are. But I wanted to share with you just a little bit of background and kind of how I became interested, and then to focus today on just antique roses as well as a few modern roses that we've evaluated in our display gardens that we think have got huge promise and that we're having great success with. I was so thrilled when Sharon sent the email and gave me the invitation. And I was greatly appreciative of the time slot. She told me I only have 3.5 hours to complete this program. So I promise I will move through it at a quick pace. But Chris, my first introduction to roses was working in a nursery in Auburn, Alabama, where I grew up. I worked for the Garden of Eden, which is no longer there, and it was always the new guy's job to have to transplant all the bare root roses that would come in, right? Thorniest job, new guy, they would throw you out there. And I remember I transplanted over a week's time about 250 bare root roses, and at that time we were using the biodegradable containers. You know, you pop right into it and then the gardener plants the whole 9 yards into the ground. And I fell in love with Double Delight. That was the one that really got me hooked. But I learned about those roses, and from that point on, started really getting interested. When I finished high school, I had an opportunity to go to college. I went to Auburn University, and there I studied landscape design. And from there, couldn't quite make up my mind what I wanted to do when I grew up. And all the professors said, well, if that's the case, you just keep taking classes till you figure it out. They said, you write a check for another semester and it'll occur to you. So I went on to graduate school, and I met one of my mentors there, Dr. Bill Welch. And at that time, Dr. Welch was continuing to garden with and write about antique roses, the subject that we're going to talk about today. In fact, he had published a book called Antique Roses for the South, and that was what he was passionate about. And when I sat down with him to talk about graduate studies and the possibility of working with him, I asked him, I said, Dr. Welch, why are you gardening with and writing about heirloom plants as opposed to the newer introductions? Because it seemed to me that all the excitement was really around new plants, not necessarily just roses, but new plants in general. And he said, I can answer that question in one sentence, Jason. He said, or if you think you're up for a challenge, he and his wife Diane were rebuilding a cottage garden around an early 1900s Victorian home in Round Top, Texas, which was not too far from College Station. He said, you can garden with me over the next 2 years while you complete your degree, and you can figure out for yourself why I'm interested in writing about these heirloom roses and these heirloom plants. So for the next 2 years, I jumped on that challenge. I loved it. Every weekend, I would go out there and spend the weekend tying roses, pruning roses, planting bulbs. I learned the answer to the original question I had asked Dr. Welch. He's gardening with and writing about these heirloom roses and these heirloom plants because they're survivors. They're still here today because of their durability, their toughness, their genes. And they can handle the droughts that we experience. They can handle the floods. They can handle the extremes in weather conditions. We were just talking in the hallway, almost 60-degree high tomorrow, and then Wednesday morning, 18 for a low. And then we've even got snow in the potential. So we need plants that can survive these extreme fluctuations in temperature. And what I learned from Dr. Welch, among other things, was when we look toward these heirloom survivors, these kind of plants, we're going to find those that are tough enough to survive these extremes in our garden. I do want to put in a plug for him because in 2017, he and another one of his proteges named Greg Grant wrote a book called the Rose Rustlers. And on the cover, it features a wonderful old garden climbing version of Belinda's Dream called The Farmer's Dream. And this is a spectacular collection, great stories. Both of these guys are as entertaining as they are educational. So if you get a chance and you want to do a little bit of research on there, he talks about their many escapades and how the Rose movement began. And this renaissance of sorts began with California, certainly the East Coast, and then these Texas guys and girls in the middle kind of building the interest. And now we see a lot of these roses that were potentially at risk of being forgotten about coming back into the trade. And so to me, that's kind of the excitement. When I finished graduate school, I remember being a couple of months away from graduation before I finished graduate school, and I had thought of an idea of what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I remember Dr. Welch calling me into his office, Chris, and he said, "Jason, your mother has called and she'd like to know if you know what you're going to be when you grow up. You know, or are we going on for another degree?" And I said, "Nope, I'm moving back home to Alabama, where I grew up, and I'm going to start a nursery that can be devoted to tough plants for southern gardens. But I want to take an extension service type of approach gardening from an educational standpoint by building display gardens." I had fallen in love at the Antique Rose Emporium when I walked through those display gardens and I saw these wonderful climbing roses just dripping and falling down from pergolas, from gazebos, along fences. And I had walked through and breathed in those fragrances, and I saw how I could grow those. And Dr. Welch had taught me how to cultivate and to grow and to even root and make more of them. And I decided I want to come back home and build gardens that could emulate what I had seen and gotten inspired with. And then people that came to visit me could learn in the same fashion. And over the years, Sharon, as you've mentioned, our vision has grown from 1994 when we began the nursery to not only include antique and old garden roses, but when my dad retired from Auburn University as the fruit specialist for the state of Alabama 16 years ago, I hired him immediately. And he is working harder for less than he ever has. But he has taken 7 acres and made them into display fruit gardens, so that if you want to grow an edible landscape, you can learn about blackberries and blueberries, Sharon, as you had mentioned. You can learn about figs, you can learn about muscadines, all the way to citrus, as you had mentioned. And he can use those orchards for teaching. But it also has given us an enormous amount of diversity, so people that are visiting can come in and they can pick their own fruit, as our original intention was. But what's been nice is it's given us an avenue to go into Pepper Place Farmers Market each Saturday during the season. And then from there, it's allowed us to grow and to deliver to 11 different restaurants in Birmingham who are really leading, of course, the culinary charge for certain. And then in addition to my dad, my mom's full time with us. She's responsible for all of our propagation. I brought 3 different roses that my mother rooted from stem cuttings and that represent kind of what we grow and the size rose that we're marketing. And then in addition, I'm very fortunate to have my wife, who was a graduate student at Texas A&M while I was there also, and as the most knowledgeable plants person that I have ever met. My wife, Shelley, can identify a plant at 55 miles per hour. That's the only person I've ever met that can do that. And one of her many jobs is to travel all over the Southeast and try to find, at risk of being forgotten about, heirloom plants.
Is she one of the original rose rustlers?
Yeah, she is. And you know, the original Rose Rustlers, Texas Rose Rustlers, started in 1982 with Pam Purrier and Margaret Sharp and Bill Welch. So it was a little before Shelley's time, but we certainly came in and joined in as graduate students at Texas A&M, and what a great group to work with. I'm going to get into a little bit of that as we get started as well. So at any rate, that's a little bit of background and kind of what our focus is there. We started in 1994 and have grown each year, and our interests have grown and spread and diversified a little bit to try to make sure that we're covering all interests of gardeners. But our underlying theme continues to be the same. We're trying to grow tough plants for southern gardens, showcase them in an educational setting, and then have them available. So if there's something that you see that you like, we want to have grown it. And we feel good about that because we feel like if we're cultivating 80 to 85% of all of our plant material at the nursery, the distance you would drive from Birmingham to our nursery, that's the distance that your plants are being cultivated from your home, and we feel like they're going to be more acclimated. We're going to be able to handle that 18 degrees on Wednesday morning in that 70 degrees, that we'll have probably a week from now, and be able to acclimate to that. Whereas we feel like if we're bringing in plants from the Northwest, they've not ever seen a Jefferson County July, and that's the thing. We know that makes a big difference. And so that's a little bit of background about our nursery and kind of what our focus is. And what I'd love to talk with you about is this class, Chris, if you don't mind. Antique or old garden roses, many of you will already be familiar, but for those of you who are not, your basic definition is any variety of rose belonging to a class of roses that were introduced prior to 1867. But that first characteristic that's associated oftentimes with antique roses, it's the reason I grow them. I fell in love with the fragrance. Shape, certainly you get a great shape from these roses, and thankfully disease resistance. And that's a big component. Nowadays, of course, and certainly in the climate that we live in, we're faced with every common disease that roses are going to be addressed with, and nobody's more familiar with them than you are. Just showing a slide, typical cottage type of garden where we're trying to incorporate roses alongside perennials and alongside shrubs. So with the types of roses that we're growing, with these old garden roses as well as some of the modern, more disease-resistant introductions, we're trying to allow them to be an element of the garden so that when they're in bloom, they make a great show, but when they fade back, perhaps there's a phlox or a sun-tolerant hydrangea or iris or other perennials that can add interest to that garden. For cutting roses, certainly hybrid teas are at the top of the list for opportunities for cut roses, but we still find a nice group of these old garden roses that can lend themselves. Typically shorter stems, we move to shorter vases, but the color palette I like here, because this is pretty typical of what we see with antique and old garden roses. A lot of muted colors, a lot of pastels we find when we look at the old garden roses. There's the odd red, but very few bright, vivid yellows or oranges until we get to modern roses. So if you like pink, you really ought to look at old garden roses for sure. Species class. So when we talk about that broad definition of antique roses, I like to talk about the different classes within that group that exist that are particularly appropriate for southern gardens, for the American South. The species class, of course, these are the original class of antique roses. If they were to have a motto, it would be wild by nature. Typically in this class, we're going to see spring bloomers, super disease resistance, lots of climbers and ramblers that are fantastic for softening structures, and more of a natural or woodland type of garden they're going to be appropriate for sure. I think any discussion of old garden or antique roses is incomplete without talking about this, probably the most famous of the climber roses that we grow, ladybanks. Many people have grown it and never thought of it as an heirloom rose, but we're looking at an 1824 introduction. And of course, you know it for its thornless canes, beautiful yellow blooms. I always love to poll an audience when I'm talking to them, because I can always say, how many of you have grown ladybanks? Every hand practically goes up. But then I can ask, how many of you have successfully imposed your will on ladybanks? And no hands go up, right? Because of the nature of that growth habit, that's a rose that you really want to put in a place where it can ramble and grow and not be bothered. One of the others that we've had great success with is our early species rose called Rosa multiflora Carnea. And this is a wonderful rambler up to about 20 feet, wonderful fragrance. But again, 6-8 weeks of bloom in the spring. It's here on an east-facing rail. And you've got about 3 primary main canes that are in there in the background that are producing this enormous flush of bloom that you smell all over the nursery when this guy's in bloom. Albertine, certainly a massive climber, was this. You can, when you look at a structure like this, an 8-foot arbor, and Albertine's planted on it, you have to know that was a garden emergency. This was a gardener whose daughter had told her just 12 months prior to the planting of this rose that she wanted to be married, she wanted to have an outside wedding, and she wanted to be in this garden. So the only choice we had was to plant one of the species roses, because they're the ones that, when they finish their bloom in the spring, they just put all of their energy into growth. So 12 months was no problem for Albertine planted on either side to get up and over. it produces a wonderful spring bloom for about 6 to 8 weeks. Fragrant, large pink blooms that are coming from a coppery colored bud. And we made a great show. Then we immediately dug those 2 roses up and put them out here on the fence, where they now ramble to 25 plus feet without any trouble. American Pillar, another one. By simply wrapping these canes around the base of this post, we can keep color for about 6 to 7 weeks with American Pillar from the bottom, right there where the mulch is, all the way to the top. This has been a wonderful rambler for us to use on this pillar. One of my favorites, the first 2 roses that we found in our county were actually introduced by the Barbier family. Albert Barbier we found on a bank in Chilton County, in Jemison, Alabama, where we live, and it was growing up there mixed in with blackberries. And every spring we would see underneath those blackberries along the ground these dark yellow buds that would then open within a short time to these cream-colored blossoms. And I can remember they were getting ready to widen the road, and they were going to take that bank completely out. And Shelley and I were driving through there, and Shelley, like she's done so many times, said, "Stop the car." And she said, "You need to get some of the cuttings of that rose, because we've been watching it for about 3 years, and we don't have that rose." So I stopped the bulldozer driver, and I knocked on his window, and I said, "Would you mind if I got a few of those cuttings before you widen the bank?" And I learned a couple things that day. Bulldozer drivers don't like to be stopped in the middle of a project, and they really don't care that much about roses. So he said, "Get it and get out of my way." So we did. And this is a picture that was taken 2 years after we planted that Albert Barbier. Wonderful rambler, too small of a spot for that rose, but that was in the late 90s, when I was just getting started, and I wanted that arbor covered. Petite, I got it. Petite pink Scotch. This is a rose that I love for its cascading habit. It's one of those roses that will actually keep its foliage in Jemison, Alabama through the winter, but if there's no support beneath it, makes a brilliant trailing form. This is a landscape not far from the nursery where she had previously just used a trailing juniper, and she said, "I really just want something that can give me a little bit of bloom." And Petite pink Scotch blooms up and down the length of those stems for about 6 weeks, and then her foliage is evergreen just like the juniper was. And then every other year, she mows that rose down to about 3 to 4 inches from the ground, and it comes right back out, just as big and pretty as ever. I think one of my favorite ramblers, one of those roses that will literally just lay across any structure without you having to do a lot of tying or fussing over, would have to be Leontine Gervais. And I love this one as it lays across the top of the pergola. We've taken it up these posts and laid it across the top, and we've not had to worry about tying it down. It doesn't have those wild hairs like many of the modern climbers or any of the old garden climbers will. It just literally lays across the top of that structure, blooms for about 6 to 7 weeks in the spring, and then it's finished. Climbing Pinky, one of the polyanthus that we have on the front 2 posts, of course blooms spring and blooms summer and blooms fall. I've used Leontine Gervais. Again, I told you this is one of my favorites. This is the home where Shelley and I live, and it's one of those homes where when the driveway was poured, you only have a small amount of planting space, maybe about 12 inches max. So the only choice you have is to go vertical. And this, to me, was a perfect opportunity to address that vertical element with a rambler. This is my daughter Corey's room, and of course she's since graduated, is now a junior at Auburn studying natural resources. So she's since moved out, but I thought it'd be nice for her to be able to look out her window and see a beautiful rose hanging out. And so I was so inspired with that one that I moved over to the other side of the house. And then I pinned this one, a Leontine here, and I was so thrilled with the way they performed over the height of that window that I went ahead and took it over the garage, and now it's wrapped around the other side of the house, so you can't get just too much of a good thing. But when it blooms in the spring, we are the envy of the neighbors, for sure. This is one of the roses I brought with me today, and this is a horrible slide, but I never have my camera with me when I'm getting ready to take a picture of this one. One of the roses we began the nursery with, Rosa palustris scandens, which is in paintings from Redite that was in Empress Josephine's garden. And I feel like she was the original Rose Russell, right? If she could have Napoleon stop wars so that ships could pass through with her rose collections, I want any rose that could belong in that garden for sure. And this is one that's actually indigenous to the southeast as well. Swamp rose, as the name implies, can grow in those low areas along streams where the water's high, and the root system can actually spend a great deal of time underwater, which is unusual. But it's thornless. And when it blooms in the spring for 7 or 8 weeks, you absolutely cannot walk past it. It's not a very formal blossom at all, kind of a semi-double, wonderful arching shape to about 8 feet. But I love the fragrance of this one. So I put it on the corner so that when anybody passes by, there's no way they can't brush past that rose. And as a result, it's ended up in a lot of gardens, thankfully, for sure. A few of the climbers, these are modern, and I think many of you will recognize them, but these have just performed exceptionally well in our display gardens. And if you don't already have them, I would encourage you to consider them. I think New Dawn has made the cover of every garden magazine, and you can grow it from Pensacola, Florida to the New England states. I do caution you because you can do that, to a wall without any trouble whatsoever. But many of you will remember that New Dawn is a 1930 introduction, and it's the repeat blooming sport of Dr. W. Van Fleet. Great Maturiana parentage there. There's that farmer's dream. I love this one. This is one that Greg Grant introduced as a climbing sport of Belinda's dream. Large blooms, nice light fragrance, beautiful glossy foliage, and oh my gosh, 15 plus feet. The trouble I'm having with this one, Chris, have you got this one?
I do.
Has it repeated yet for you? I'm getting spring blooms that are phenomenal, but I'm just not getting what I was expecting in a second flush of bloom.
I saw Greg about this time last year.
Yes.
Down in the street board.
Yeah.
And he said give it a couple of years.
Okay.
It's really going to put its roots down and then the shoots just come.
Great. Good. Well, I'm looking forward to it. If I can ever get the fall flush of that, I am really going to be excited.
How is it related to Belinda's Dream? Belinda's Dream does not repeat. I've got it.
Has it not repeated for you?
No, I've had it for 20 years. It does not repeat.
Well, I'll tell you, I've got an en route form of Belinda's Dream that I collected from Bill in his Mangum, Louisiana garden. And it has been a good repeat bloom for me. And what Greg's talking about, this, which is the cover of the Rose Wrestlers book, is a climbing sport. So it was a natural mutation, basically, of the shrub form of Belinda's Dream that just rambled and climbed. So he rooted it, and that's how this one came about, for sure. But I've yet to have it give me a second flush of bloom, for sure. Mermaid, if you have tough skin, this is a phenomenal climber that Cleo Barnwell in the Shreveport, Louisiana garden, before her death passed away, had this in 2 locations. And I mean, this thing will climb through. She had it around and up in the top of a pecan tree, if it gives you any idea. It is a repeat bloomer, a hybrid bracteata. This is the one that gave Mike Shoup the real encouragement to start the Antique Rose Emporium with Bill Welch. Back in the 80s. And there it is on a wall. And again, bottom to top, brilliant bloom. But remember, hybrid bracteatas, like Mermaid, have got a recurved thorn. So when you go in to get that rose to pick it, you're okay. It's just you can't get back out. I'm sure there's a couple of people inside of that rose. But, Dortmund, again, another modern. This is the 1955, a very young rose, but oh my goodness, this has been a good performer for me. I like that single petal form, that woodland type of appearance, a very glossy, shiny, waxy leaf. It's been a nice rose for me to be able to use on a wall or a trellis. Now, the original repeat flowering class of roses, single petal versions, were around before the birth of Christ. This class right here, which is uniquely suited for the South, I think offers us a lot of opportunities. They're referred to as the China class. And of course, named for country of origin, the Chinas typically have a fruity type of aroma. We're looking at a photograph here of Old Blush that's in the pink form here. In the backdrop, those are the berries of a dwarf version, another Asian plant of dwarf beautyberry. which are only coloring in the fall. So when you're looking at it here, you're seeing a fall flush of bloom that is spectacular. So these are, the original Chinas are the workhorses. When it comes to repeat blooming, we're using them in our display gardens as hedges, as an individual specimen. We're mixing them into perennial borders. That, of course, that rose would never win Best of Show, but you've got a workhorse. If you want just a good rose for a lot of bloom, what we're finding, the spring blooms and the fall blooms going right into Christmas are fantastic. The midsummer blooms, it varies a little bit. I don't get as heavy a bloom sequence as I do in the spring and in the fall with these old Chinas. Nutabilis, often referred to as the butterfly rose, easily 5-6 feet. If you prune, you can grow this as a small climber, but I love what it illustrates, which is something kind of unique to the China roses, and that is that they will open very, very bright and light-colored and actually age darker. So rather than opening dark and fading with sunlight like we used to most of our plants doing, these will actually open with a lighter color and age darker. Old Blush, the original stud China. This, of course, is a 1752 introduction. Later, a little bit later on, a climbing sport was introduced. But this is considered one of the 4 stud Chinas that if you've ever grown a rose that blooms more than once, somewhere in that lineage, Old Blush exists. I like it for a good medium shrub, 4 or 5 feet in that range. Kind of a loose arrangement, but nice for a hedge. This is the climbing version of Old Blush, easily 15 feet. And for us, the Chinas are always the first roses to bloom in our garden, and they're the last ones to finish. Our Old Blush has small buds right now, and it should know better, for sure. It's going to get bit, for sure. It does a great job of softening the picket fence, and it's even hiding my propane tank there. So I like that. Louis Philippe, one of my very favorite reds. This is an 1832 introduction, about 4 feet. And again, spring, summer, and fall bloom. Nice fruity type of fragrance as well. Old garden teas probably, though, are the most sought after of the old garden roses that we grow, and I think for good reason. The larger individual bud, the more grouping, the larger number of petals, and of course the aroma. It's supposed to smell like cool, dried tea leaves. And between the 1830s and the 1860s, this was the class in the South that you wanted to have in your garden. Large blooms, you could cut not particularly strong stems, so those buds will nod as the flower opens. And as a garden specimen, it's spectacular because then they're looking you right in the eye. As a cutting specimen, shorter vase, they work quite nicely. But like the Chinas, which are one of the parents, you've got a repeat bloom sequence, but definitely heaviest in the spring and in the fall with intermittent bloom during the summer. Georgetown tea, wonderful, we've had great success with. Nice pointed bud there, wonderful pink that opens up to a very large individual bloom. Isabella Sprunt, that's actually not a bad yellow. Again, lots of pastels. Isabella Sprunt comes out with a very dark yellow bud, but opens to a lighter, creamier color. But you can see definitely where this is one of the grandparents. You see the similarities. This is one of the grandparents of our modern hybrid teas. One of my very favorites, Monsieur Tillier, that kind of carmine colored, going into a red, makes a brilliant show, and then layer after layer of petal. Mrs. B. Arcant is my absolute favorite. If I had to be pinned down, it changes on a given day, but I always come back to Mrs. B. Arcant. And we've got both the spring bloom. Here you can see snapdragons in the foreground, and then again a wonderful fall bloom with Salvia leucantha, Mexican bush sage there in the background. Great, great fragrance. And again, flowers and foliage from the bottom to the top. Duchesse de Brabant, another of the old garden teas. You can see a lot of pinks in there, right? I like the crimson to bronze colored new growth that you get with these guys. Large cup-shaped bloom Duchesse de Brabant. When you read about this one in the literature, this was Teddy Roosevelt's favorite rose. I always love any discussion of American roses in the South. You got to include this because this is the first class of roses that were actually have their origin in the U.S. John Champneys, if you do your research on this one, was a rice planter in Charleston, South Carolina, who also dabbled in roses, and that's where these guys put their introduction. Lots of climbers within this group. But that is the original first rose that was introduced in the U.S. It has an amazing amount of fragrance for such a small bloom. The blooms, of course, occur in clusters. We're growing a Champion's Pink cluster as a small climber to about 12 feet, and it gives us a wonderful spring bloom. But it gives us a phenomenal summer bloom. These roses, when it's 100 degrees outside, keep blooming. They don't really slow down like some of the Chinas and some of the teas will. They're hitting their stride when we start getting in the upper 90s. That's Champion's Pink cluster on a wall fence, A little bit later on, they started looking at these small flowered noisettes and crossing them with the old garden teas we were just looking at. The result, of course, are the tea noisettes. This is a nice example, Wanda spray. Love this one. Comes out with a little bit of an apricot blend and then opens to a creamier color. Wonderful 20-foot climber, spring, summer, fall bloom. Natchitoches noisette. I was first introduced to this rose by an avid gardener in Mississippi who shared that with me, and I took it with me to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I was trying to find out a little bit more of the history of it. And I walked into a knowledgeable group of Louisiana gardeners, and I said, "Do you guys know anything about this Natchitoches noisette?" And they said, "Well, the first thing is you're pronouncing it incorrectly." And those Louisiana gardeners are so polite, thankfully. They said, "That is pronounced Natchitoches." And of course, they took me to the cemetery where that was found. But, growing up in East Alabama, I would have never gotten Natchitoches out of that, for sure. So they were kind enough to share with me the name, how to spell that, and its origin. It doesn't even have a year of introduction. This was a natural occurrence that was a chance seedling, and it happens to have more characteristics of the noisette class than any other class, so it was given the study name, Natchitoches noisette, and that's kind of stuck. It blooms spring, it blooms summer, it blooms fall. It makes a really nice shrub to about 4 feet, or you can train it as a small climber for a pillar. Rev D'Or, one of my very favorites of this tea noisette class or cross, easily 20 feet. This is a very, very fast grower. And again, spring, summer, fall, great repeat bloomer for those arbors. Where I was planting the spring blooming ramblers, I learned my lesson and have started, of course, planting repeat flowering, either ramblers or climbers that are more manageable, more in the 15 to 20 foot range than the 50 to 60 foot range. I love my rugosas. Not all of them, of course, are appropriate, but as a class, these guys that are native to sand dunes in Japan, we see them planted from the East Coast where they border this ocean and can handle that salt breeze. They can produce a brilliantly fragrant flower that oftentimes is followed by a hip that can be used, of course, in your tea and make a brilliant show. One of my favorites for our display gardens has been a white flower form called Sir Thomas Lipton. I use this often as a substitute for Blanc Double Day Colbert. We're asked for that rose quite frequently, but we've had better success with Sir Thomas Lipton, particularly on its own roots. And it blooms spring, and it blooms summer, and it blooms fall, and it has a wonderful fragrance. But one of the things that rugosas are known for are thorns, and so if you've not grown them, they have thorns on top of their thorns. So be on the lookout for that. Hansa, another good double flower rugosa that we can grow. Hybrid musks. We're getting away from antique roses, but I like to include the Musk Roses. They're introduced from the late 1800s through the 1930s. Reverend Joseph Pemberton did a lot of work on these guys, and I like to include them because they're versatile. This is another repeat flowering class of roses with great disease resistance and fragrance that can offer us a little bit of versatility in the landscape. We can use them as hedges. That's how we've used them more often than not. On a small form of pillar, we can use them, some of the varieties that are larger, we can use them as arching shrubs, we can use them on hedges, and they'll bloom for me in full blazing sun, but they also will bloom for me in 4 hours of sunlight. So varieties like Prosperity have been a great, great choice for us to be able to work with. That's it in the hedge, coming into the entrance to the nursery. That hedge, by the way, has no irrigation system. They get fertilized 3 times during the growing season and pruned. I'm lucky if I prune them 1 time per year. I get them off to a good start. Ballerina, one of my very favorites. I've always felt like this looked more like a pink hydrangea than a rose. but it makes a really nice arching shrub. I've tried it as a climber, and it, for me, works much better as an arching shrub. Moonlight, very much like Prosperity, but a little bit less of the pink blush. Lavender Lassie, great climber. And again, small individual blooms that occur in clusters, and it's spring, and it's summer, and it's fall. I love this combination. We're looking at Rêve d'Or, of course the Clemens Henry I planted in there with it, but Rêve d'Or, the Noisette on the left, and Zephyr and Druin, one of our favorite bourbons on the right-hand side. Polyanthus, again, modern roses, but many of these late 1800s, early 1900s introduction that give us a little bit more versatility. A lot of gardeners that I work with have smaller spaces, but yet they want roses to be included in there, and they want some of those to, of course, have their fragrance. And with Polyanthus, it varies a little bit. But typically, we can look for more compact 3 to 4 foot shrubs within this group. Of course, there are climbers in there, but like the Noisettes, these Polyanthus are going to give us that solid summer bloom. So if you need bloom during the middle of July, the Polyanthus are a class that can afford us that. This is one of my favorites. This one we brought with me today. It's one of the roses that we began the nursery with, our original cuttings. This one came from Dr. Welch's garden. He had it in a container planting, but it's one of those thornless shrub roses we've been so thrilled with. Mary Zoll, when she was doing garden designs here in Birmingham, fell in love with this one, and so thankfully it's in a lot of gardens around the Birmingham area. But about 3 to 4 feet tall, about that wide, and it's spring, and it's summer, and it's fall with fragrant blooms. A little bit, a few years back, a darker pink sport of this was introduced called Marie Dale, and it's equally fragrant, similar size, just a little bit darker pink form. Climbing Pinky, of course, has been planted all over Birmingham, and I have been thrilled with this one. We have it on the west corner of the farmhouse, where it's allowed to grow up to about 10 feet on that post and then down the rails on either side, and it's just a perpetual bloomer. It does not have much of a fragrance at all. I cannot detect much of any fragrance, but what it lacks in fragrance, it makes up for in proliferation of bloom. Cecile Brunner, which of course maybe you recognize as the original sweetheart rose. There's both a climbing form and a shrub form. The shrub form, like Marie Pavier, about 3 to 4 feet, or if you prune, and about that wide you can maintain it. But the climber is 20 feet plus. A 1932 introduction, the Fairy, I think everybody's probably familiar with, love that one. There's a wonderful climbing version that is a good repeat bloom for us as well. And then modern shrub rose, we're into the 1980s here with Marjorie Fair. This has been a really good performer that that has not received a lot of attention. Looks like the red ballerina or a small red hydrangea. And then last but not least, I wanted to include a few of the found roses. One of the things to me that's exciting about, many things that's exciting about roses is that we are still finding roses that haven't been introduced yet. And the chance seedlings that are occurring, the plants that have been overlooked or forgotten about that can be reintroduced. It's, to me, a lot of fun, and part of the enjoyment we had of working with the Texas Rose Rustlers came out of that. This is a variety called Caldwell Pink that still goes by that study name, that was found by the Texas Rose Rustlers outside of Houston, Texas, on the way to Caldwell, Texas. It's a shrub easily 4 feet in height, reaches out wider than it is tall, so about 5 feet or so in width, and it is spectacular in mass plantings. Spring, when it's 100 degrees outside, it's still blooming, and fall. So spring, summer, fall. One of the things that I enjoyed about getting together and meeting with the Texas Rose Rustlers was the camaraderie. You know, when you're like we are today in a room full of people who are passionate about a similar subject, it to me made it a lot of fun. But one of the things that we did as Texas Rose Rustlers, which sounds like a rough group, but believe me, we had our rules in place that we followed. There were no guns or knives that were allowed, and we would go to old home sites, to cemeteries all the time. And I remember one of the things that cemented in my mind the importance of collecting these roses was a trip that we made from Texas to Mississippi to see the Gestalt Gardener of Mississippi. And I'll never forget, we go into this cemetery, and you could be armed, the best things that you could be armed with. Pam Puryear, who founded the Texas Rose Rustlers group, said you needed to have a sharp pair of clippers, you needed to have a good amount of insect repellent, you needed to have something that was sure-proof of poison ivy, and she said you needed to be able to say friend and friend and don't shoot in many languages. And so all those were important things. And I can remember going over to Mississippi. We were in Jackson, Mississippi. We went to a cemetery. And why can't I think of his name? Chris, the Gestalt gardener. I'm thinking of who is the crazy certified, wrote the book Pass Along Plants with Steve Bender. Why can I not think of his name? He's just... anyway, I'll think of it at the end of the meeting. Anyway, he works previously for the Extended Service and has written extensively, travels all over the place, and is admittedly just a crazy, crazy gardener. And I remember us going, he took us out to this early 1800s cemetery. The last person who had been buried there was probably the mid-1800s. And we had brought all of our supplies, willow water, as well as our sharp pruners, and we're going through and we're looking around, and it's early in the morning when the fog is still kind of over the tombstones, and the only sound that you can hear out there is click, 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 just our clippers, and we're dropping these cuttings into our buckets of water, and he looks over at me, and he says, "Jason," and it startles me, because we're just 12 of us out there, and it's complete quiet other than our clippers, and I said, "What?" And he said, "I want you to look around and tell me what you see." And so I described for him just what I've described to you, these old tombstones, beautiful sayings, the last names of those occupants, and these brilliant roses that were just arching over, dripping with bloom. And I described that scene to him. He said, "I want you to remember this. If dead people can grow these roses, you can grow these roses as well." And I thought, that is a really good thing to take to heart. So I thought, all right, that's it. That cemented it for me. If that could happen, I needed to grow these roses, and we needed to try to preserve them. And so out of that, lots of roses came. This is another Texas find that was later on identified as one of Griffith Buck's introductions. And so it's in the trade under the name Katy Road Pink, even though it has another identity, Carefree Beauty. Many of you may have grown it before. And it was found growing and forgotten about, and then a little bit of research, thankfully, revealed its true identity. But no matter whether you grow it as Katy Road Pink or Carefree Beauty, you can grow it in the Gulf Coast South. Or, like Griffith Buck originally intended, you can grow it in Canada. And so it blooms 5-6 feet tall, spring, summer, fall, makes brilliant hips on that rose, and has superior disease resistance. And then that's another rose I brought with me today. Many of you have read about. Chris was mentioning that he had transplanted one of these roses just yesterday, and my back aches for you because I know this one was my job at Bill's weekend home to prune. When I was first introduced to this rose in 1993, we called it the air conditioning rose because that's what he had planted it to do. Its job was to soften this fence which covered this air conditioning area. Well, that rose can easily triple that size space that it was allowed to. And so the air conditioning rose, I pruned literally once a month just to keep it in shape on that. It is thornless. It is eventually a fall bloomer as well as a spring bloomer, but it is vigorous. And it got a lot of press when, after Hurricane Katrina, it survived in Peggy Martin's garden. And it had been in her family and spread from Baton Rouge to Plaquemines Parish over to Medier, and all through that region for generation and generation and generation, her family, and nobody ever knew the name of it. Nobody ever gave it a name. So after Peggy came back to her home and found that everything had been destroyed, the house was leveled, it had been under 12 feet of who knows what kind of water, two things survived. This rose resprouted in a crinum lily, and we all know nothing will kill crinum lilies either. Those old milk and wine lilies. So she called Bill to tell him about it, and he said, "We need to get together and name that rose." And so thankfully, she finally relented and let him name that rose for her. And now that rose we have shipped from Oregon to New York down to Miami, and it grows anywhere. And it grows fast everywhere. And so there are still roses that are being introduced. There's still a lot of excitement that's going on in the rose world. And this is a class that we're really having a lot of fun with. And I'll stop there, but many of you are probably already growing these, but I was thrilled when Mark Chambly started really pushing me to try a new class of roses, the Cordes roses. They are, of course, trying to breed and pull out of their selections varieties of roses that are going to offer us fragrance, and they're going to offer us better disease resistance. And so we're trying to evaluate a number of those roses and keep in our display gardens to see how they can perform. And so we're only a couple of years in, but we're seeing a lot of promise. And I'll mention just a few of them. Bordeaux has been a particularly nice rose. And these roses give us more opportunity for cutting than our antique roses typically do. The Carmela Fairy Tale has been a spectacular one. I saw this in Buddy Guilford's garden down in just outside of Dothan, Alabama, in Hartford, Alabama. And that is one challenging climate. That wiregrass region and the heat and humidity, if it can survive there, I feel confident it can survive just about anywhere. Low-growing, nice landscape rose with lemon fizz colorscape. Plum perfect, just a good color. It's hard to resist that one for sure. Poseidon in that same light color. I have been really pleased with that one. And then last but not least, Savannah, another pink, right? Just what we need. That's the last slide, Chris, if you don't know. And so those are some of the varieties that we're having great success with. Some of those I wanted to mention. Many of you may be already familiar with a lot of those, but if you're not, this is my reasoning to consider antique or old garden roses. We like them for the fragrance. We love them for the overall shape. We love them for the disease resistance. Their ability to be propagated and shared from one generation to another also, to me, makes them especially worthwhile.
Jason, are you actually offering Cordes roses now?
Yes. Now, we're not a grower. We're not propagating them. I'm getting anything that Mark Chambly says, Jason, we need to grow this rose. You know, he's evaluating them there in Tyler, and I have been really pleased with everything that he's sent to me.
But you're selling them to customers?
Yes. And we've started with just a small selection of them. Are any of you guys growing them? Anybody else trying them? What do you think so far, Paul?
I like to do it. Beverly's another one that I like.
Beverly? Yeah. Good. Anybody else growing those Cordes roses? Savannah? It's a good yellow, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the same rose.
Well, and you know, this is the thing. A good, solid yellow rose is tougher to find. You know, of course, we've all tried the Floribunda, Julia Child, been a spectacular performer, but we need more really good yellows, and that's something that we're looking for. With the antique, the old garden teas, we've got some brilliant yellows, but they're very pale, bright. Pearl de Jardin is a good example, bright yellow buds, but then it's going to soften a little bit, and it's pretty susceptible for us to, of course, mildew, powdery mildew in particular, for certain. I know, Sharon, that I have taken up my 3.5 hours. For sure. So, a lot of time.
Now, we know you'll want to learn more about Jason Powell and Petals From The Past down in Jemison, Alabama. Visit their website at petalsfromthepast.com, where you'll find the full collection of roses that Jason spoke about on today's broadcast. They also ship throughout the United States. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Rose Chat podcast, and we thank you for listening today. Until next time, happy gardening from your friends at Rose Chat.
You've been listening to the Rose Chat podcast with Chris Van Cleve and Teresa Byington, expert rose gardeners who want to help you achieve the rose garden of your dreams. Don't miss an episode. Listen anytime on our website at rosechatpodcast.com or listen on the go via the Rose Chat app on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Share this podcast with your social networks and join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by using the hashtag RoseChat. Join us next time for another edition of the Rose Chat podcast. The Rose Chat podcast is a production of the Rose Chat Media Group, Birmingham, Alabama.